Hi, and welcome to the first installation of the AI webinar series. My name's Justine Arthur. I'm the Global Marketing Director for Rezilion and your moderator today. For those of you who aren't aware of Rezilion, at Rezilion, we harness the combined power of human and AI through our suite of end-to-end quality engineering services, software testing, cybersecurity, conformance, interoperability, and also media content QC. So we're well placed to support our clients in leveraging AI for efficiency or to understand and mitigate against risks. So let's go to the topic today. The topic of today's webinar, thank you all very much for joining, is all about AI generated code. Is the future of efficiency or risk? Is it the future of efficiency or risk? It's kind of the million-dollar question that everyone is contemplating nowadays, because if there's one thing for certain, it's that no one really knows the answer yet anyway. We've got three panelists today who are going to help us talk through this topic, and let's see if we can get closer to answering this question. Firstly, let me introduce I'll go through the introductions to our panelists, and then we're going to have a quick poll as well to see where you guys are in terms of your topic. In terms of our panelists today, firstly, let me introduce you to John Anthony. He's the founder of Adapt. John has been a reputable figure in the tech industry for over 25 years with a strong focus on AI and innovative technology solutions. John's worked with global organisations such as the World Health Organization, highlights his commitment to driving AI-based innovation across industries. Welcome, John. Secondly, let me introduce you to Bert Lagasse, an associate professor at KU Leuven University. Bert has been an associate professor for more than 20 years at Belgium's largest research-driven universities. Bert is now researching the advancements of AI development for the DistriNet Research Group. And thirdly, let me introduce you to my colleague, Robbie Putzes, the global head of quality engineering practice here at Rezilion. A true veteran in the IT sector, Robbie's been at the forefront of the major technology advancements for the last 20 years. Presently, he leads Rezilion's quality engineering division in supporting our clients through their AI journey. So welcome, everybody. Thank you. Before the discussion, I just wanted to get a bit of a baseline, really, to see where you guys are on your journey with regards to AI. So if you could just look out, there's going to be a pop-up that's going to come on your screen for our first poll, or it might come up in the right-hand panel. The question is your organization or team already utilizing AI generated code in any form today? Great if you could answer the questions on here. I think there's 4 points on here. One is yes, but only in test environments. There's also one for yes, all the way to production, or no, but considering it in the coming year, or no, it's not even on the horizon for us. Okay. Robbie, I'm not sure if you can see some of those answers, but it's actually looking really positive. You've got quite a mature crowd here, actually. At the moment, we're looking at 45% say yes, but only in test environments, which is interesting, with a kind of split at the moment between 25% of people say yes all the way to production, or no, considering it in the coming year, with only 5 saying it's not even on the horizon. So you're in good company, panel. Any comments on that, Robbie, before we move on?
No, I think it's a bit, first of all, interesting to find out where people are in this journey, a bit reflective of what we expect, that it's finding its way more and more into software development projects. So I think that's a good basis to have this session on. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Robert's in production at the moment. Robert, I don't know if everyone else can see the screen. I don't see the PowerPoint slides at the moment, but if they're there, we'll continue. Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Okay, thanks for your input for that. Now I'm going to hand over to John. I don't know if you've got any comments on that poll, but obviously one of the key things we want you to discuss now is let's explore the AI revolution. Okay, discuss the cons and the risks with John and Bert, the risk of adopting AI generated code.
Perfect. Good afternoon. Well, I think it's afternoon for most people now, depending on where you are. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Anthony. I'm from a company called Adapt. We are probably best known for some of our work for the UK government trying to prevent domestic abuse and homicide using AI, using large language models. And currently we're doing an awful lot of work with the World Health Organization where we're trying to predict and prevent the next pandemic. We couldn't really do that without AI. So for us, AI is this huge boon. It's like sitting on the top of a wave with your surfboard, anybody who surfs, or your equivalent sport, and trying to pick the time. You will use AI. Some people are a little bit scared of it. If you're sitting on top of a big wave, you're probably quite scared of the point that you have to drop and go for it. But in reality, it's where the opportunity is. So yeah, AI will transform software development because it can and because it does already. It's definitely not going to eliminate jobs, but it will change jobs. You know, there's always this phrase that, you know, AI won't take everybody's jobs. It'll take the jobs of people that don't use AI. And I think that's true. But it increases productivity. And what does an increase in productivity do? Fundamentally, it makes us all richer. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you look at the way that we live today versus the way that the kings in the 15th century lived, we have a higher standard of living. We have heating, we have hot baths, we have showers, we have television, live entertainment, we've got food and drink on tap. You know, these are enormous luxuries and they've being brought about by increases in productivity. So fundamentally, increased productivity on the scale that AI can bring makes us an awful lot richer. Does it make us equally richer? Not necessarily, but that's part of the debate. And I think part of, you know, what people are afraid of. Why I'm not particularly afraid of AI, you know, most of us understand these days that certainly large language models have advanced in the way that they communicate and process, but, you know, transformers are fundamentally next word predictors. Mary had a little and you'll say lamb, and I say Mary had a little lamb and you'll say it, and then fleece. And that's the basis of it. And that means that we can train large language models on these huge corpuses of information that we have over the internet. Now we can understand language. That's the training that we use. When it comes to you and I logging into our banking apps, logging into our finance apps, logging into our HR apps, logging into the systems that run our day-to-day lives, we've got decades of experience using an app, pressing a button, going to the next screen, going to the next screen. AI hasn't yet been trained on those systems. So I'm not particularly worried about AI being able to architect a user flow because it's not what it's been trained on currently. Doesn't mean that it won't be in the future. So a quick view on where AI sits. It's an absolutely brilliant assistant right now. It's not necessarily coming for your jobs. Next slide, please. So for me, particularly with the work that we do in mental health care, I've been recently working with a clinical psychologist. You often see AI talked about as the equivalent intelligence of a 14-year-old. Together, we trained up an AI consultant to counsel people with PTSD. We looked at that. We looked at how you might externalize the fears that you have and the stages that you take people through. It was incredibly effective at doing that. That's just one example. And if you use it correctly and you prompt it correctly and you train it correctly and you combine different models together, you get brilliant results. So where do I see AI in mental health care? Where do I see it in personal treatment? This is phenomenal, you know, and there are a lot of people right now in a waiting list, in backlogs that can't get help. So whether it's breast cancer scans, whether it's mental health care, AI has an ability to bridge a gap where, frankly, the healthcare system can't reach anyway. So for me, I think it's a huge benefit. Does it have risks? Absolutely, it has risks, but there are risks with humans as well. You know, I think, you know, we look around and not every doctor's perfect. Some are better than others. It's a scale. The same will be with the way that AI is created. Next slide, please. So this is probably one of my favorites. You know, creativity is fundamentally what we deem it to, you know, is part of what we deem as being humans. It's it's part of our humanity, it's part of our soul, and all of a sudden machines come along and they start doing what we do, and they start exhibiting emotions and showing. Now, and you've got to understand that AI has been created on the information that we have created and generated. So it is, it is difficult to understand where AI sits in the arts. An amazing piece of music, if we enjoy it, do we listen to it because it's been created by AI? Do we want to? Do we want AI creating art and music and entertainment for us? Potentially, if art and music are an expression of our inner self, then somebody else creating it, AI creating it, doesn't fulfill that need. So now I'm into this statement that I often see, which is personally, the people that I talk to, we want AI that does the dishes and the cleaning so that we can focus on creating music and art. Where does AI sit in our society? If you just want to be entertained, maybe it does have a role to play. If you're a creator, maybe you actually want to make the most of your creations and actually have AI doing the housework. Next slide, please. This for me is interesting. It's potentially controversial. Our planet is run by 1,000 or 2,000 very, very powerful people. We have a United Nations. It attempts to bridge the gaps. A lot was set up after the Second World War to ensure that we never went through that again. The UN struggles. We don't have a standard democracy template. We don't have a Bill of Rights that is adopted across the planet. People want justice. People want things to be fair. A lot of the wars that go on around the world are about perceived injustices. But who's the arbiter? If America steps in as the world's policeman, people don't like that. If America doesn't intervene as the world's policeman, the UN should be taking that role, but does the UN have the ability to take that role with the restrictions it has? So we need an impartial arbiter. AI does have the ability to be an impartial arbiter and to look at case history, to look at situations, make judgments. Would we accept those judgments? That's the question. Would you trust AI? If I was set up correctly, I personally would trust it, but then you've actually got AI that's been set up by other developers, and those developers themselves will implicitly influence the way that the AI runs. So there is a huge opportunity for AI in governance. There's a huge opportunity to create a level playing field across the planet, and whether that's in transactions or trade, or whether it's in disputes, that range exists. It can make the world a better place. Clearly, we're all scared of how it could make the world like the Matrix and a much scarier place. So it's a great point to debate. And next slide, please. Ethics. So there's an awful lot to discuss in ethics, and particularly, again, when we're using AI to create software, what you've got to realize as well is that initially AI has been trained on our language, and then we had to put guardrails in it because some of the language that we've used on the internet can be quite offensive. Now we worry about AI training on content that AI has created, and that's quite dangerous because the quality could go down. But actually what you're seeing are AI models are already training AI models. So whilst we're using code and we're using AI to generate our code, AI is using AI to generate the next generation model, and they are incredibly powerful. So where does this sit on our ethics scale? The American National Rifle Association, as Eddie Izzard will tell you, says, they say guns don't kill people, people kill people, although the gun does help. AI is not necessarily going to go out there and abuse our ethical standards. AI will not commit genocide. AI will not necessarily start wars. The people using AI may well. And that's where the danger is. The biggest danger here is that AI is an incredibly powerful tool in the hands of the right or the wrong people. So when it comes to ethics, it's as much about the ethics of the people using AI as about the guards in the AI itself. It's pretty easy to take those guards off. We've all proven it time and time again. You put the guards into AI, somebody clever comes along and takes those guards off. And to be honest, myself, my team, it was one of the first things we did was say, okay, where are the limits? How do we get around the guards? It's the people we need to look at right now. And to be honest, we have a society that promotes sociopaths and psychopaths to a degree, particularly sociopaths. we vote for strong leaders. We like strong leaders. We have shown that we will put sociopaths at the top of the tree. So it doesn't take a genius to predict what comes next when you put sociopaths in charge of AI. And I think final slide. And I wanted to go through that reasonably quickly because I did want to leave a lot of space for debate.
Excellent.
So questions, thoughts?
Thank you so much, John. And you said you were going to be a bit controversial, and I think you were there. Although I'm well up for the housework one. Thank you very much, Robert. I think we've got another poll, actually, haven't we? All focused on, of all the AI code applications that John discussed, which do you think will establish itself first? Would you say it would be the creative and design AI? Would you say healthcare, governance, or cybersecurity? Really interested in your views here, please. If you wouldn't mind voting on the poll that should have just popped up. Okay, let's have a little look here. Yep. Okay. Can you see those results? Have they popped up for you, John? Can you see? Are you surprised by some of those results? I think we're talking 52% around the creative and design, 26% around healthcare, 17% cybersecurity, and 4% governance. Do you have any thoughts or views on that?
So I love this. And I think this is where do people want it as much as where do they think it is. So in reality, and I might share a really quick screenshot, the cybersecurity industry has been using AI for well over a decade in production. So it's not where will it come next. It's already in there, and we've been using models trained by AI. We call it transfer learning, where you create. It's the same as the Matrix, where Neo goes in there, you plug something into the back of his head, and he learns kung fu. It's called transfer learning, and it's how we use AI models to create copies of themselves, and then we evolve them with AI. So the correct answer, I think, is cybersecurity. Where would we like it? Definitely in creative and design, healthcare and governance. I thought healthcare might be slightly more advanced. That's probably the only thing that I'm not sure about on those poll results. And I will just show you because I think it's fun to see. This is an AI security system that classifies people. It's 10 years old, and it looks for people that behave slightly differently than the rest of the organization, using TensorFlow, using neural networks. It's been around a long time. We're already using it.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Okay, Bert, so really interested now for you to take the flip side of the discussion and discuss the cons and risks of AI generated coding, if that's okay, please. Over to you.
Thank you for introducing me. I'm happy to be the party pooper today when it comes to AI, to be the devil's advocate. Can you bring on my slides, please? Seems something is wrong.
No, he's just flipping it on there for you.
Can you see the first slide of my presentation? I still see the three faces.
Robert,
okay, there are my slides. Thank you. So when we talk about AI-generated media, like text, images, sound, it all looks good. It all looks kind of good. It sounds kind of good. Good enough to be processed by our brain and fill in the blanks, and our brain can deal with the inaccuracies in the media. However, if the text becomes code, I think we have a little problem, because that text needs to be processed by a compiler that is not forgiving against statistical inaccuracies in the code. Basically, if you look at the technology underneath, like John already announced, it's token generation based on statistics, and it predicts the next token based on a text corpus. And in the case of AI-assisted software engineering, that text corpus is code. And there we introduce the first problem, that text corpus of code. There's a lot of code in there coming from tutorials, and tutorials take shortcuts to explain something, and that code is often not ready for production. So if you can bring on the next picture. On the next slide, please. Okay, so this great message about ChatGPT said, well, we tested it on 4 million programmers and ChatGPT was better than 15% of these programmers. However, if you look at the questions, it's basically a very easy questions about the tutorial. It basically asks, well, how would you multiply two matrices in Python? Well, that's almost a verbatim copy from the tutorial that it was trained on. So those are the easy questions. And of course, these easy questions can be answered by something that can memorize really well. ChatGPT is also known to be really good at the bar exam of the New York attorneys. We all know it's just memorizing things, right? That's basically the problem, but it can't do logical thinking. It can't do math, and that is the main problem. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Some researchers in 2022 produced a really good paper where they tested a lot of programs that were generated with GitHub Copilot, and they found a lot of vulnerabilities in it. And vulnerabilities have a certain type, which is called the CWE, a common weakness enumeration. And a lot of the tests that they did was with C code that needed to be generated. And one of the well-known problems there is out-of-bounds writing, such that you write input from a user into the memory of the program and can load additional code and do really nasty things on a system that you hack. Improper neutralization of input. You can do cross-site scripting if you allow JavaScript to be injected in some website, or SQL injection and delete data in the databases. All these kind of typical rookie mistakes were in the code that was generated from GitHub Copilot. Now I have to say, if you can go to the next slide, please. And then that paper from 2022, they redid the tests, and in 2022, 40% of the code was vulnerable. They did the test again in 2024, and it was still, I think, more than 25% of the code that was generated that had serious vulnerabilities in it. But I have to be the devil's advocate of this paper. The researchers tricked GitHub Copilot in giving vulnerable code because they started with code that was coming from examples of vulnerabilities. And of course, this thing looks at the next token and it says, hey, I recognize this piece of code. It comes from that text corpus. I'm going to complete it with what I know, and that is seen a lot in examples and tutorials online. And as such, that vulnerable code was presented to the user, in this case, the researcher. So we did a more neutral test. And if you can go to the next slide, please. What we basically did was, and maybe the picture with the code too, if you can add that. We played the junior developer that would ask a neutral question to ChatGPT. And he's a junior developer and he has to implement a REST service, and he has to validate an incoming token that proves the identity of the user. So I ask how to validate an incoming token in a C# web API. And this code is generated and it compiles and it works, and the happy part of the program executes perfectly. You know who the user is. However, there's a big problem with it. If you present a token that is coming from somewhere else or was intended for a different REST service, and those two lines that I would like to highlight, validate issuer is false, validate audience is false. This is coming from online tutorials from Microsoft that I know. It's shortcuts from code to practice this API, and it basically eliminates the validation of the one who handed out the security token to prove your identity. And it also eliminates the check if that token is really intended for this REST service. So the happy part will work, but an attacker will also be very happy with this code in your production code. So we did a more broader test with some researchers. And if you can go to the next slide, please. What we did, and can you include the pictures too, Robert? What we did, we asked ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot to generate code for Flask, which is a REST API framework for Python, and Spring Boot REST services with Java. And we asked it in 3 ways. In a neutral way, where we say, please generate a REST API that checks the incoming token. And then we asked, well, can you do it really focusing on security, that is really secure? And then we also asked, can you do it in a way that it is ready for deployment in production? And basically, the code that was generated, you see an N in this table. It means it didn't even compile. It didn't run for sure. And if we asked the ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot to fix the error, it couldn't fix the error. So we fixed it ourselves, just where it didn't compile because they used some deprecated library or some deprecated function. And then we scanned the code with a SNC, which is a static vulnerability scanner, and another vulnerability scanner. And we basically realized that there were a lot of high-risk vulnerabilities in this code of these REST services. Now, I have to say there were no critical vulnerabilities, like using a vulnerable Log4j library that they could immediately hack the system. But the high-risk vulnerabilities, like SQL injection, adding database passwords hard-coded in the code, all these kinds of high-risk vulnerabilities were in there, and a junior developer could just copy that into the code that he's creating for some company, right? So if we can go to the next slide, please, I would like to show that these tools have problems, and risk is a multiplication of the impact with the likelihood that the problem occurs. And we asked 50 junior developers, do you use these code generation tools and for what? And 98% uses ChatGPT, even if it's not allowed by the company. They use it on some shadow IT device to help them producing the code in time. And if you can go to the next slide, please, which is my final slide, I want to end up with a kind of Cassandra prediction. In the future, we're going to have 3 kinds of code in our systems. Code that is written by a human or is generated by a static auto-completion tool like we do now, which is fine. There's going to be AI-generated code that has been edited, read, and revised by a developer, if we are lucky, that it went through his brain and he saw the mistakes or the shortcomings. But there will be plenty of AI-generated code that is blindly copied by junior developers into the system, just like they blindly copy the text from ChatGPT in their papers these days. And it will look good, and probably the happy path will work. But the question is, what are the hidden slumbering defects hiding in the unseen? And we will have situations where the code reviewer, the white box testers, will be the first pair of eyes on the code, which is way too late, and we are losing the first pair of eyes and the understanding of the developer that wrote the code and the connection with the code. So I want to give back the words to Justine and John and Robbie. And that was my Cassandra prediction.
Well, thank you very much. And look at all the open-mouthed emojis that are coming through there with the shock of what you've put, freaking people out there. So thank you both very much for 2 sides of the coin. We do actually have another poll as well, actually, before we move into the discussion and debate. And I know John's raring to go. I can see him desperate to come in with some questions there. So how would you rank it compared with other types of risks in terms of financial impact to your business? AI, that is, by the way. Would you say, I think it's, legal risk, copyright concerns? Would you have security risks, security vulnerabilities in the code? Which one would you put in top order? I think this is the way this poll is to be focused on. So rank them compared to other types of risks. Performance risk, maintenance risk. What are you thinking? You can shuffle them about to the top of the or the bottom as you feel. Oh. See how that's starting to look. Cool. It's all people are still doing it, so it's moving a bit at the moment. Oh, look at that one, shuffling up a bit for performance risk now in 2nd place. So at the moment, it's looking like you've got In fact, Robbie, you can jump in, or Bert, on this one actually, if you like, as you can start seeing the poll moving, and then we'll move on to the discussion.
Happy to go first with a few observations, and then I think everybody can chip in. That this is an interesting poll for sure. So first of all, thank you, John. Thank you, Bert, for very interesting views on this topic. Bert's presentation focused a lot on the security risk, and this poll is actually expanding that a little bit and actually trying to map out a bigger landscape of potential risks. And it is interesting to see that the majority still looks at the security risks as potentially the most impactful for the business. I can see that. It's also an area where I think more research is available, and because people have been identifying this early on and have been researching it a little bit, so it's maybe a little bit more known. There are other areas that are very interesting actually in the industry to consider more thoroughly and think about mitigating it, such as the legal risk. There is copyright. There are copyright concerns. Maybe in a day-to-day business, people are not necessarily always confronted with it. If the code runs, it executes in a normal business environment. Not necessarily people are concerned with that risk. However, if you're in a different situation where you have IP transfers to arrange, when a company gets acquired, all those kind of situations, it is very important to know, the code base, and actually if you're not potentially using open source where you're not aware, because you would need to adhere to those, or potentially maybe even copywriting commercial code without being aware. And then the functional risks, performance risks, maintenance risk, I will recognize that the maintenance risk is also an interesting one where I think longer term we will know more about this, and this is what I think Bert alluded on at the end of his presentation as well. What if the developers of the community working on a project are going to be less in touch with the code? What does that mean for maintaining that code base going forward? So very interesting, and if I were to answer this myself, it's relatively in the same way I would do it. For me, the maintenance risk, I would personally put it a little bit higher. John, you want to give your take on this?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with the way that things have lined up here. What I love the phrase, if you think a good developer's expensive, you should see the cost of a bad developer. And the security will bring down a company, will bring down an organization. So it is the biggest risk. And at the moment, AI, out of the box AI definitely does not give you the guarantees that you need in terms of security. And to be honest, neither do junior developers. Security has to be handled at the highest level to get it spot on.
If I can fill in. So I think there's two major risks here. It's like my friend John said, people kill people with guns. If these tools, these AI tools, are used in the wrong way by a lazy developer, he can cause a lot of havoc, I think, create a lot of problems, that's for sure. But I think there's another problem, is the deep learning technology that is underneath this needs lots of data. And the people collecting the data, curating the data set, are not always completely aware of which data they include in this data set. They need so much data that they will cut the corners on the quality of the data or the legal risks of the data. They use text to train these models that they should not be using because they don't have the copyright on it, and then the model starts spitting out this text that looks a lot like copyrighted material. So the data sets are, in my problem, the first problem. We need too much data to train these models, and the people curating that data set are cutting corners to get all that data to make it better. And they cut corners in terms of quality of the data or legal risks of the data. So those, in my opinion, are the two threats, and it's twice the people, the users and the people creating the data sets.
Really interesting. Justine, this leads us, I think, to the end of the scheduled presentations.
Absolutely. You're in the debate session. Yeah, go for it. Let's discuss
perfect.
it.
So again, thank you, John. Thank you, Bert, for your contributions thus far. And there's so much to unpack just in this topic, because AI, of course, there's so much to consider in itself. We're now focusing in or honing in on AI generated source code and trying to unpack just this part. At Rezilion, we will be releasing a white paper navigating the vulnerabilities of AI generated code soon on this topic as well. Again, breaking it down, looking at it from our side. But now with the debate, we aim to take some further interesting perspectives on the topic of AI generated source code. Again, we have a few questions that we would like to present to both John and Bert. I'll chip in where potentially it would be an interesting additional take that we could offer as Rezilion as well.
Before you do, Robbie, would you mind? I think John's got a bit of a question, if that's okay.
Of course, John, please.
So first of all, I wanted to thank Bert, because there's a lot of research and study has gone into what he's presented. And Bert and I weren't sure whether we'd agree with each other when we started this process, and we said, well, we'll definitely keep it friendly, but the gloves are off. I very much agree with what Bert has said, but I also want to say that it applies to we've got 150 developers. Some are amazing, some are fresh, some are very hardworking. And so how do we deal with it in a software company? And we deal with it in a software company by division of labor. We break the tasks up, we have pull requests. And I wanted to show you really quickly a couple of things, how we generate synthetic data, because I think it's interesting, and how we make language models work together. So I just share screen really quickly. And this was the example I talked about, but we use this approach for lots of things. So these are the different AI models, and each conversation, each personality here is a different AI model, and they're talking to each other. And basically the doctor is trying to teach Matteo how to externalize his feelings and talk about a never-ending storm. We use this for synthetic data, but we also use this approach. Dr. Sarah is an external observer here that you'll see comes on. The AI is deciding who goes next in the conversation. We use this principle to set up guardrails. So having AI personaed, having AI typed in a production line allows us to say, okay, we have AI as QA, we have AI to look purely at security issues, we have AI to look at your code quality, we have AI to reject you. And by putting those gates in the stream, we start to mitigate what Bert's been talking about. It doesn't make it go away, but that's the approach that we take as we start to mitigate that. The other thing that I want to show you really quickly, because this changes the landscape. I'm old, so I used to play Doom. I love Doom. It was, and it probably types many people in the audience as whether you played Doom. That clip that you're looking at here has no procedural code in it. This entire gameplay is generated entirely with a neural network. So now we're moving on to a completely different type of code. And I think that's interesting to debate as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Robbie. Yeah, if you want to start working through some of your questions, and then if everyone's got any Q&A, just remind you can pop it in the Q&A section, and we'll get to that as we go through, or if they're relevant to the topic, we'll bring them in. Okay.
Perfect. So we'll first do a few questions, and we'll take some Q&A questions in as well. First area, let's consider for a moment, or let's explore together the long-term effects that we envision. So, and that we would be both on the positive and the negative side. So the concerns we may have, or the advantages and the gains we can foresee with specifically the adoption of AI-generated source code. So let's maybe take John's view first, and then Bert's view afterwards. John, do you want to share your view on the longer term? What are we looking at?
And I think it plays into Nevin's question, which is more prevalent in code development regarding human error versus AI error. We don't let AI run on its own right now. So we use AI to generate a lot of code, but we don't trust it. So the long term is, when do we get to the point where we can start trusting AI code on its own? We're definitely not there. When? I don't know. Elon Musk has been promising self-driving Teslas for the best part of a decade, next year and next year and next year. You know, I believe we all think it will come quite quickly. I'm not yet convinced.
There's an interesting question from Nevin. Can I read it?
Yeah, go for it.
Which is more prevalent in code development regarding human error versus AI error? So who's the most error prone in coding, the human or the AI? I think today the AI is still too much trained on tutorial codes, and the average developer is better, in my opinion. However, the average developer is also a bit lazy, so he will be using the AI tools, and I think the quality of human code will go down because they're too much relying on AI generated code these days. And these AI models that generate code, they're always a bit outdated. They're trained on outdated code, and they generate a lot of deprecated codes because they need so much data of the past decade to train these models. And I think if you go online and you look at a tutorial online that is full of dodgy ads around it, you know you should look at that code with a grain of salt, right? But if it's presented by these AI tools, it looks so good and it comes so fluently, people have a false feeling of trust in this code, I think.
I do agree with you. I think the thing is, before we were using GPT and before we were using AI to help us find the solutions, we were going onto Google and we were using Stack Overflow.
Yes.
And you can say the same thing. And so I see people picking up code every day from Stack Overflow, and I'm very, why have you used that? And they were like, well, it's the right way to do it. And I'm like, it's not the right way to do it. And I can see where it's come from in Stack Overflow. So you are right, but that problem has always existed.
Yes. But there you see the context. You see the context of Stack Overflow and the dodgy ads, and maybe that person that puts the code there that wants to be first, and you're not going to trust the code. But it's presented by ChatGPT. People have the wrong feeling that that code is different, but it's actually almost of the same quality as the ChatGPT code. As the
agree, and I think if you take that code without understanding it yourself and making a judgment on it yourself, you're asking for trouble.
Indeed.
But doesn't AI offer a type of scale or magnification that we may not have been used to as a community, and it leads us to wonder what the recursive effect of this may be. So for the longer term, if let's say source code is being produced with, maybe in let's say less diligence potentially, and again I recognize potentially due to human laziness, less reviewing and so on, but ultimately this will feed back into new training regimes and so on and so on. So I'm really interested in both of your views on the AI recursion here that we may be looking towards for a longer term, and also what could we do to mitigate it?
Well, they did that already with images, right? They generated a lot of images and then trained a new machine learning model to recognize images based on those images. And they ended up with very strange artifacts in the generated images by the recursive model. So I have not seen it specifically for code, like where they trained a machine learning model to generate code based on synthetically generated code. But yeah, probably the artifacts will be enlarged if it's the same pattern as with the images.
It's also about, we talk about recursion. So for everybody that's not aware of what we're talking about here, AI trains on the material that we find on the internet. If the material that we find on the internet is generated by AI, AI is trained on AI generated material, which creates the loop, which dilutes the quality. At the moment, large language models were initially trained as language interpreters on the entire corpus of the general information that we find on the internet. And, they were originally developed for chat software to help support centers. Now they've evolved into incredibly useful tools. When you look at GitHub, for example, You can judge code by the pull requests, you can judge code by the quality, you can judge code by the issues. It is possible to train AI code generators when you dedicate that to a much higher standard. AI is also now training AI, and what we see is that the models trained by the big AI models train the smaller AI models and train them to a very high standard. So we will probably continue to see the standard of AI coding improve.
Perfect, perfect. In the meantime, we had a question coming in. I think it was addressed to Bert. What is the best path forward regarding AI? Should we refrain from using AI at this stage, or is there still significant work to be done before we can consider using it effectively?
Well, good question. I think we have to reflect on the state of the software engineering economy first. We're in a race to the bottom to save cost and time. And depending on the project, if you're developing the software that will steer the next rocket that goes to Mars, you will use higher standards than when you have to implement a new app that will advertise a new car from Dacia, for example, right? There will be different kind of testing, different kind of quality. How do we go forward? I think we need to do a risk assessment. What are you building? If you're building something very riskful and you don't always know, for example, a marketing application that goes online that gathers emails from people, and you have a leak, and that data set of everyone that is interested in the next Dacia car is an interesting data set for lots of companies. Or you're developing a mental health app like the Livin app is now really popular, where you link your identity to a certain mental problem. If that data set leaks because you used AI-generated code, yeah, it happened in Finland. I think the CEO of a company there was extorted because they found his name in a leaked data set of a mental health app. Criminals like this data, and I think if you create an application that leaks data and that data is abused by criminals, you have to think about that risk and make sure that you do the necessary testing, the necessary pen testing with the application, especially if the code that is used have never been processed by the brain of the developer.
Yeah. And this leads into basically another area we wanted to explore, and also aligns with just an incoming question here. And so maybe it's worth spending a little bit of both of your time, and I can also chip in on that, just exploring software engineering practices going forward. So basically, this is, we have a new capability now with AI-generated source code. So what are some of the practices that now need adoption by software development teams and software testing teams in order to, at one hand, benefit from this new technology, but while ensuring also software quality with the AI-generated source code specifically? Maybe John again, going first, because you just heard Bert on his previous answer.
So I think security is huge here. I think everybody on this call cares about quality. We really care about quality, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. Every day as a software house, we are against a range of companies, and some of those companies are very cheap. Now, when it comes to AI, we will be against companies now who will be undercutting us maybe by a factor of 4, and they'll be planning to use AI. We live in a world where the code we build is built on dependencies on dependencies on dependencies. And what I mean by that is if we have a library that needs to parse PDFs, if we have a library that needs to parse maths, it's a library that somebody else has written. As we use more and more dependencies, a lot of the time we've survived by security through obscurity. A lot of those vulnerabilities exist, but they haven't been spotted yet. AI changes that landscape. You're going to see an increasing number of exploits flooding through. The more dependencies that you have, the more exploits you're going to pick up. The more cheap code that we have, the more exploits you're going to see finding their way into software. So the security problem is about to become tenfold. And so the whole software development life cycle, where does AI testing sit in there? How do we deal with that? That's the critical conversation right now, because you will see software start to fall apart increasingly over the next few years as those dependencies break. And as we see, one dependency can bring down huge numbers of systems.
Really,
and again, CrowdStrike can bring down an entire planet.
Yeah, correct. Bert, do you want to give your view on that as well? How are we now looking at potentially evolving software engineering practices with this new reality of AI generated source code?
So I think I want to answer that with a question from Nevin again that he asked first, like, can't we just test the ChatGPT code? You know, we have these vulnerability scanners. If the code comes out of ChatGPT, we apply a whole lot of vulnerability scanners, and then we just copy paste it into our application. There is a fundamental law in computer science, and it says no program exists that can prove that another program is correct. We cannot even determine if it's going to stop that program, let alone that it will give the correct output. The only thing we can do is check for problems with these vulnerability scanners and say, well, the vulnerability scanner didn't find any problem. It doesn't mean there is no problem. However, a human can. A human has the logic to see the problems in code or to prove that a piece of code is correct. Our human logic can do that. It can prove that a piece of code is correct. Another program can't. So we have to use our brain to the max and not be lazy and read every line of code and think about it. Is this really doing what I expect it to do? Yep. So humans have to stay human. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, and they need to be kept sharp as well, and not become, let's say, lazy or complacent. So that's definitely a challenge I think that we're looking at. But it's a really good take on it. Maybe a quick
before you do, Robbie, just going to say we've got the Q&A open. So if you've got any of your questions, I think a few people have started to raise their hand. Would you mind posting your questions on the Q&A? That would be great, please. Sorry to interrupt, Robbie.
We're keeping track of the Q&A, so thank you everyone basically for the engagement, and we're trying to systematically work your questions into the conversation, and I think we've done a pretty good job so far. I think we're pretty much on top. So I just wanted to give a bit of a view of Rezilion as well on this. So we've been, of course, looking at this obviously for our business, which is trying to help organizations with software quality in general, in the broadest term possible. So there are a few things that are becoming increasingly important. One thing is I think organizations need to have a look at just adapting software development and test policies to acknowledge the fact that generative AI is there, both on the software development side of things, which is the core focus of this debate here today, but also as part of the test process and to potentially leverage it. So, and it can be adopted in both of those areas, but with the right caution and considerations. Traceability, I think, is also an interesting one. AI generated source code, making sure that the process, the software development lifecycle, allows this to be, identified more clearly in the process, so that code reviewing practices and unit testing practices can be adopted and adapted to that. And it is about, I think, what also I think Bert is alluding to a little bit. It's always a matter of risk-based work. So software testing is risk management. So risk-based hardening of test coverage, again, with those areas that are potentially labeled and identified as leveraging a lot of generative AI source code. Of course, there should be then an emphasis on a higher test coverage with a lot of automation, and then a special attention to security testing, non-functional testing as well, as for load and performance, for instance, where it can, of course, be that we need to consider that code would be less optimized. Same care and consideration needs to go into when we would leverage generative AI in the area of quality assurance, which is a very exciting field. We're looking into that as well. Of course, we're embracing it as Resilion, but again with the same considerations and the importance of the human in the loop principle. However we use it, we have to make sure that there are enough checks and balances before things get fully adopted in the process. And then, of course, the general practices of continuous improvement in software development and test practices, gathering a lot of intelligence about results, defects, learning from that, and continuously improving and hardening the test approach. So those are a lot of ingredients that how we see this and how our practices are evolving. In the interest of time, I'm just having a look here where we're nearing the end of this session, which is a really interesting session so far. We have a few questions that we could still do. Also, if there are more questions from the audience, please send them in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably quite a good idea to maybe do some closing statements, Robbie, because we've got a couple of minutes left. And I just wanted to say as well that we've also got a survey to get people's feedback at the end. And obviously, you've got an announcement to talk about future webinars and things as well. So maybe if we could spend 2 minutes, cutting it fine, 1 minute, 30 seconds each on a closing statement, and then we can do some wrap up if that's okay.
Sounds good. Who should go first? John?
I'm happy to go first. So like the Industrial Revolution, change is coming. Honestly, we're not stopping it. Any others, it's going to happen. You know, I likened it to a huge wave and surfing it. You know, you should be on that wave. Don't miss it. It is really exciting. There is so much to do and so much that you can do. But, you know, get an instructor. Make sure you wear safety gear. Be sensible. You know, don't make the mistakes, you know, and I do thank Bert because the mistakes and the potential to go wrong is very, very real. But, you know, at the same time, don't miss it. This is a very exciting phase of humanity for me.
Thank you very much for that, John. Have you got a 30-second closing statement, Bert?
Yeah, so I've been using AI generated content a lot, like to get a first sight on a research domain, like what are the tools that exist for something, and it's really good in giving starting points that you then continue working on. But we have been using code generation in the past decades a lot based on static interfaces to do testing. And I think AI generated code that is doing more statistical generation of code can be used to let the input, for example, variate or let some testing flows variate. So I think there is potential for AI to help with testing software next to the typical static code generation that we have been doing in the past 20, 30 years.
Excellent. Thank you. Robbie, do you have a closing statement?
Yeah, maybe one on behalf of Resilion and maybe a personal one just to thank everyone as well. But just as Resilion looking at this, this is a very exciting time for our company. And this is definitely not something where, let's say we have some level of, you know, that we're scared of this innovation or anything like that. It's actually something we embrace. It gets us excited to just look at a new set of challenges and deal with it properly. So as I mentioned, we're looking at all kinds of adoptions in terms of testing and QA. And at the same time, we're looking at how do we improve the quality assurance practices for AI-generated source code. And with all of that, with both of those areas, it also comes down to the level of maturity that you have already mastered as an organization, because you need to see this as the next step up and first get a number of things in order. From the testing side of things, it is having a very solid testing strategy in place. And then you can start considering these new evolutions in our domain.
Excellent. Thank you. So just to wrap up, we have another webinar happening in Q4. We have an AI white paper being launched in the next week or so. But before you go, I would be very, very kindly, please, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a quick vote and giving us your score out of 5 stars of our speakers and our content today. And if separately, the team will be reaching out to you guys anyway, just to kind of get your feedback and if this hit the right mark with you. But it will also be on replay available for you as well. And thank you so much to our panel of speakers. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bert. Thank you, Robbie. Loved both sides of the coin there. And we hopefully join us for future webinars. But I'm sure your LinkedIns are firing up now. Lots of people wanting to connect to carry on the debate outside of this. Thank you.
Thank you.